Hello everyone and welcome to this lecture in the Build Large Language Models from Scratch series. Today it's a very interesting and exciting lecture because we are going to complete the instruction fine tuning project which we have started. In the previous lecture we fine tuned the large language model on this instruction input and output data set, and we proved that after the fine tuning the LLM is much better at responding to instructions. So the previous lecture was an awesome lecture and we obtained a great result at the end of it. If you have not seen the previous lecture, I would highly encourage you to go back, check that lecture again. So let me just show you in the flow map where we are in the stage of the fine tuning process. So we have finished the stage number 1. So let me change to purple ink. We have finished the stage number 1, which is preparation of the dataset, and this involved dataset download, batching the dataset, and creating data loaders. Just to revise, this is the dataset which we have been using, which consists of 1100 instruction input and output pairs. And we are telling the LLM that, hey, we know that you are pre-trained very well, but you are not very good at responding to instructions currently, and I want to train you again so that you are better at responding to instructions. Here is the data which I have, and I want you to learn from this data so that you get better at responding to instructions. So this is the data set. We spent a lot of time earlier on batching the data set. So we needed to implement several steps so that within each batch, all of the input samples have the same number of token IDs. And after the batching is done, we created the training, the testing, and the validation data loaders. Remember that we used 85% of the data for 85% of the data for training, 10% of the data for testing, and 5% of the data for validation. And when I say data, I mean this instruction data file, instruction input and output pairs. Right. Then we also completed stage number 2. In stage number 2, we loaded a pre-trained LLM. So we loaded the weights which are publicly available from GPT-2 so that the model has a good foundational base. And then on top of it, in the previous lecture, we fine-tuned the LLM, which means that we trained the LLM again, so that it learns based on this instruction input-output data set. And then we also saw the loss function in the code. So just let me take you to code right now and show you the loss function which we obtained. So here's the training and the validation loss function which we obtained in the previous lecture. Due to the memory and the compute limitations on my CPU, I just ran it for one epoch. But as I mentioned in the last lecture as well, if you have access to a GPU, or if you have a stronger PC such as a MacBook M3 for example, you can definitely try running this code for two epochs or even more. We are using a GPT-2 model with 355 million weights. So it's a pretty huge model, and that's why a lot of LLM computations really depend on the architecture of the CPU, whether you're using a GPU, how fast is your computer, etc. Anyways, I've shown you this code on a computer with minimal configuration. So if I am able to run this on my PC, I'm pretty sure all of you would be able to run up till here on your PC as well. So let's look at the response which we have got. We tested using one test or one validation sample, and the validation sample was that write a response that appropriately completes the request, and the request was convert the active sentence to passive. Convert the active sentence to passive, and the sentence was the chef cooks the meal every day. The response given by our large language model was the meal is prepared by the chef every day. Now, this was not the correct answer, right? The correct answer is the meal is cooked by the chef every day, whereas our LLM used prepared. And that's probably because we did not train it for multiple epochs due to the compute limitations. In fact, I know for a fact that if you run it for two epochs instead of one, this output changes to the meal is cooked every day by the chef. Even with one epoch, we can see that the LLM is doing much better instead of just answering randomly before fine tuning. So this is the stage we are at right now. And now we have to move to the third stage, which is evaluating large language models. So you might be thinking that we fine tuned the model and now LLM is responding to instructions. That's great, right? Well, the things do not stop here because there is one big challenge. Now you can see that this response, the meal is prepared by the every day by the chef, is not exactly correct, because the correct answer should be the meal is cooked every day by the chef. In fact, let's look at the correct answer. Uh, so chef. So let me type chef here, and let's go to the actual instruction. Yeah, I think this was the actual instruction which we had given. Convert the active sentence to passive. The chef cooks the meal every day. And this is the actual ground truth answer. The meal is cooked by the chef every day. Whereas the LLM, which we have trained or fine tuned, answered the meal is prepared every day by the chef. So it's clearly not correct, right? The real question which we want to ask in the evaluation stage of the LLM is that how do we know how correct are we? So how to measure the LLM performance? It's not a straightforward answer as a yes or no binary classification, right? We have to compare between two sentences, and we have to compare and say that okay, ideally ideally it should have been cooked, but instead my LLM is saying prepared, so I deduct some points for it. But how do we define this scoring system? How do we compare between two sentences and understand whether the LLM is doing a good job or the LLM is not doing a good job? And that's why we have to devote a whole separate lecture to evaluating the large language model. So this itself consists of three stages which we are going to look at. The first is extracting the responses from the LLM, the second is qualitative evaluation, and the third is scoring the responses. So let's start implementing the first step, which is extracting the responses, extracting and saving the responses from the LLM. Now, in the code, I've mentioned this as step number 6, which is extracting and saving responses, right? Okay, so as I mentioned, after fine tuning the LLM on the training portion of the instruction dataset, we now proceed to evaluate its performance on the testing dataset. To accomplish this, first we need to extract the responses generated for the model for every input, right, in the test dataset and collect them for manual analysis. So if you look at this dataset right now, this entire dataset is 1100 instruction input output pairs, and out of this I'm using 10% as test data. So what I now need to do is that I need to take my fine tuned LLM and I need to give it the test data, and I need to generate the responses for all of the test data, and only then I will be able to compare it with the output, right? Currently I showed you only one response over here, which is the LLM response for one instruction output pair. But now I want to collect the LLM responses for all the instruction input in the test data, and then I will compare it with the ground truth data. Awesome. So let's do just that. Before that, before we do it for all the different instruction output pairs, I just want to show you the results of our LLM for three test set samples which are there in the data set. So what I'm going to do here is that I'm going to look at three instructions in the test dataset, and I'm going to run the fine-tuned LLM on these instructions, and then we are going to look at the generated response. So here you can see we are looping over the test data, and then we are looking at the first three entries. Um, then what we are doing is that we are generating the output from our fine-tuned LLM. We are going to convert the token IDs into text, which will give us the final generated output. And then remember that the final output consists of the instruction input as well. We need to remove all that and just need to consider the response which is given by the large language model. And then we are printing out the input text, which is the instruction. Then we are also printing the correct response, and then we are printing the model response for three test samples. So let's look at the model predictions and the true responses for these three test samples. So the first test sample is rewrite the sentence using a simile, and the input is the car is very fast. So simile is basically using similar words. So the correct answer to this car is very fast. The correct response is the car is as fast as lightning. Whereas our fine-tuned LLM predicted that the car is as fast as a bullet. That's the first. Now here you can see that this is quite good, right? The correct response and the model response are actually very close to each other. That's awesome. Now let's look at the second instruction. What type of cloud is typically associated with thunderstorms? The correct response to this was the type of cloud typically associated with thunderstorms is cumulonimbus. Cumulonimbus. Whereas the model response is a thunderstorm is a type of cloud that typically forms in the atmosphere or a region of high pressure. It typically produces a strong wind that blows across the area, creating a dense cloud. So clearly, we can see that the model response is not good, right? Because we wanted a type of cloud which is associated with thunderstorms. So just qualitatively, I can look at the correct response and I can look at my model response and I can see that it's not really doing what it's asked to do. And let's look at the third test, which is the final test example. Name the author of Pride and Prejudice. The correct response is Jane Austen, but the model response is the author of Pride and Prejudice is George Bernard Shaw. Clearly, this is a mistake. So, out of these three test samples, without even looking at any evaluation metric, qualitatively, I can say that for the first test sample, it's very close. For the second test sample, it's not technically wrong, but it does not answer correctly. And for the third test sample, it's fully wrong. So, firstly, the reason why the LLM is making mistakes here is because we have trained it only on one epoch. Just increasing the epochs to two will really improve the quality of the responses. Even with these number of epochs, now you can see that actually measuring the performance is quite hard, right? Even for me as a person, I can answer this qualitatively, but how can I give a performance score? How do I give an evaluation score? As machine learning engineers, we always like scores, right? Such as accuracy, such as the classification loss. How do I give an evaluation score to these responses? So as we can see, based on the test instructions, the model performs relatively well. The answer to the first instruction is clearly correct, while the second answer and the third answers are not correct. This is because we have done the fine tuning only for one epoch due to hardware limitations. To get better results, we need to increase the epochs to at least two. That's number one. Number two is that model evaluation is not straightforward. In previously, we had done a fine classification fine tuning for spam and no spam emails, right? There it's so easy to evaluate the accuracy. If the correct answer is spam and the model predicts no spam, it's not accurate. If the correct answer is spam and the model predicts spam, it's good. But in this case, it's not as straightforward. So what do researchers do? There is a whole field of LLM evaluation which is becoming extremely important because people are realizing that along with training LLMs and fine tuning LLMs, an equally important field to pay attention to is LLM evaluation, because unless we have a metric to evaluate LLMs, we will not know what is good and what is bad. Then how do we know whether research is happening in a successful manner or in an unsuccessful manner? So researchers have basically developed three methods for evaluating LLMs. This is still a very new field and rapid progress is happening as we speak. But these are the three most common ways of evaluating instruction fine tuned LLMs. So the first way is, which is a very common way, is by giving the LLM a general knowledge test and by benchmarking it on actual known responses. And this is known as measuring massive multitask language understanding, or MMLU. So MMLU score is a very popular term now, and the simplest way to understand it is that this is a score which tests the general knowledge of a model. So this test measures the model performance on a huge range of questions in various fields, and then you can get the score of the model. So for example, if we have our fine-tuned LLM, right? To pass this MMLU test, we have to ask those 57 questions which are mentioned in this paper, and we'll note down the responses given by our fine-tuned LLM. Then we'll compare it with the actual responses, and based on that, a score will be generated. So, for example, here is the paper measuring massive multitask language understanding (MMLU). And if you scroll down below, here you can see that these are the 57 questions which are tested in this, in abstract algebra, anatomy, astronomy, business ethics, high school biology, chemistry, computer science, then international law, management, marketing, moral disputes, public relations, security relations. In all of these fields, there are a number of questions which are asked. So essentially, these are the 57 tasks which the model needs to be tested on. I asked to summarize this paper to a Notebook LM, which is an awesome tool developed by Google to summarize research papers. And here's what it showed. So, MMLU is a benchmark for measuring language model knowledge. It is designed to evaluate a text model's ability to learn and apply knowledge from various domains. The authors of this paper argue that existing NLP benchmarks, while useful, do not adequately assess the breadth and depth of knowledge that language models are exposed. That is why MMLU consists of 57 tasks covering STEM, humanities, social sciences, and other areas, ranging from elementary to professional levels of difficulty. We can use MMLU to evaluate our custom instruction fine tuned LLM by testing its performance on these 57 tasks. In fact, many of the research papers, if you read in the instruction fine tuned LLM space, they show the MMLU score, which means how the LLM is performing on all of these general knowledge tasks. That's the first approach for evaluating LLMs. The second approach is human preference comparison, where basically humans look at the answers given by multiple LLMs and then they compare the performance between the large language models. So, this is basically having a human in the loop, and the human using their own intuition and understanding, they benchmark or compare LLMs. That's the second way. The third way, which is also fairly common, is using a large language model itself to evaluate how close the LLM responses to the actual output. So let's say here I have collected a file which has the instruction input output, but it also has the model response. So in the third category, what is done is basically you look at the true data, which is the true output which we expected, and we look at the model response. And then we ask a large language model itself to compare between the output and the model response and to assign a score. So this is fairly straightforward to do because it's fully automated. We just look at the output, we look at the model response, and then we ask a very massive large language model to compare these two and find the score. If you think about it, this is also like taking the easy way out because we don't know how the LLM is evaluating, right? What are the metrics through which the LLM itself is comparing between the output, the true output, and the model's response? We are trusting the LLM is extremely and supremely smart to do this, to get this score for us. Since this method is simple, we are also going to implement this method in this particular video or in this particular lecture series, where what we are going to do is that we have the output and the model response. We are going to ask an LLM to look at the output, to look at the model response, to compare and to assign a score. But it's very important for you all to be aware of these three types of LLM evaluation, which is extremely important. So, considering the scale of the task at hand, we will implement an approach similar to method 3, which involves evaluating the responses automatically using another LLM. This will allow us to efficiently assess the quality of the generated responses without the need for extensive human involvement, thereby saving time and resources while still obtaining meaningful performance indicators. If you have this code and if you can run this code using the MMLU test, that would be awesome. And I would really like to see if someone works on that part of the code and take the instruction fine tuned LLM and run the MMLU test on it. Awesome. Now, the next step is that we need to basically collect the responses for the entire test file, right? Earlier, we only saw the responses for the first three examples of the test data. Now, what we need to do is that we need to collect model responses for uh, all of the instructions in the test data set, and we need to collect these responses in a separate file. So what we are doing now is that we'll prepare the responses for the evaluation process, and we will essentially construct a new file or create a new file which is titled instruction data with response.json for record keeping. This file will essentially contain the instruction input, the true output, and also the model response. So to give you a visual, this is how that file will look like. Now, if you look at this first file, which is just the instruction data.json file over here, instruction data.json, this only consists of the instruction, the input, and the true output. It does not contain the model response. But now we are developing one more file or creating one more file, which is called instruction data with response. So this consists of the instruction, the input, output, and it also consists of the model response. This will make it very easy for us to later evaluate the performance of the model, because then we simply have to compare the output and the model response for every instruction and assign a score. So in this piece of code, what is done here is that in this piece of code, if you see, we are looking at all of the input instructions in the test data, and we are generating the response for all of the inputs in the test data, and then we are collecting the responses in a file called instruction data with response. That's all. So when you run this code, the generate function will be called on all of the instruction input pairs in the test data. The responses will be generated, and only the response will be collected, and then it will be appended to the instruction data with response file. So overall, the instruction data with response file will look exactly like what I'm showing on the screen right now, where in the instruction input and output dictionary, the model response will also be appended now for every single uh, instruction input output pair. Awesome. Now, if you run this process, it will take some time. For me, it took around 10 to 15 minutes to create this instruction data with response file, but it will be created and then it will be stored for you. So remember now, this test data is the dictionary which consists of the instruction input, output, and the model response also. We can test this by printing the first element of the test data dictionary. So if you print out the first element, you will see that we have the instruction, we have the input, we have the output, and then we have the model response as well. The output is here, and then the model response is here. So the test data dictionary essentially now consists of everything which we need. It consists of the instruction, the input, output, and the model response. Now, what we can do is that once we have this file, so everything is ready for us to evaluate the output and the model response. Now, what we'll do is that we'll just save our fine-tuned model. This is extremely important because if you accidentally close your working session, then you don't want to fine-tune again, right? Remember, fine-tuning took 4 hours for me on my PC, and I just want to reuse the fine tuned weights again when I start my session the next time. So please don't forget about this step. It's very simple. You just have to use the torch.save command and model.state dictionary, which will ensure that all the trained parameters will be stored in this file name, which is gpt2 medium 355 million sft.pth. This is the file where we are storing the model, and to load the model in a future session, you simply have to do load state dict. So two commands are important: torch.save, model.stateDict, and torch.save or load state dict rather. The first command is model.stateDict, so saving this, and the second is load state dict, and then you have to load the file in which you have stored the parameters. Awesome. I hope every one of you is with me until this point. So we have reached this stage where we have successfully collected the responses in a file called instruction data with response.json. We have collected the responses in this file, and we have also discussed about a way in which we are going to compare the output and the model response. We have not discussed too many details about this, but we have seen the three frameworks for evaluation, and we have shortlisted this last framework where we'll use an LLM to compare between the output and the model response. Now we are ready to move to the next part, which is essentially evaluating the fine-tuned large language model. So the evaluation process essentially will come in this building block what we have seen. Okay, so until now we saw extracting the responses, and we have also seen qualitative evaluation where we looked at the response. So let's say for example, I can qualitatively look at the output and I can look at the response and I can say whether it's correct or not qualitatively, right? But we have not yet mathematically or quantified scoring the responses. This is the part which we'll implement in evaluating the LLM. So after extracting the responses by our fine-tuned LLM, we will use another large language model to automatically evaluate these responses. And let's see how we are going to do that in practice, which is the large language model which we are going to use. So this brings us to the step number 7 in the evaluating the fine-tuned LLM. And as I mentioned in this section, we will implement a method to automate the response evaluation of the fine-tuned LLM using another larger LLM. So we'll use a bigger, larger LLM which is pre-trained, and it's extremely supremely knowledgeable to compare our model response and the true response and to assign a score. To implement this evaluation step, we are going to use a software, or it can be called as an application, which is called as Ollama. So let me take you to the Ollama application. So here, if you go to ollama.com, you can just type it ollama.com. You will see that this interface essentially comes up. And the simplest way to think about Ollama is that it's an efficient application to run large language models on your laptop. So you can run various large language models. You can run Llama 3, which is developed by Meta. You can run Phi 3, developed by Microsoft. You can run Mistral. You can run Gamma 2. Similarly, you can run several models on your PC. And remember, using Ollama, you do not do pre-training, you just do inference, which means that the model is already pre-trained. You just look at the responses, or you look at the output which is given by the model. You use the model in inference mode using Ollama. You do not use it in pre-training mode. So what we are going to do is that we are going to implement the evaluation step by utilizing an instruction fine-tuned 8 billion parameter Llama 3 model. So we are going to be using an 8 billion parameter Llama 3 model, and we are going to access that through Ollama. So the reason we are going to utilize this instruction fine tuned model is that because it's already fine tuned on a huge number of instructions. So if you search about this is the Llama 3 8 billion instruction fine tuning model, and here the 8 billion parameters are already optimized, which means that this model is already trained to follow instructions and it's supremely smart. So what we are going to do is that we are going to utilize this model to compare between the true result and the our LLM model output. So using this Llama 3 8 billion, we are going to compare the actual output and our model response, and we are going to assign a score. So we are going to tell this instruction fine-tuned Llama model that your next instruction is that look at the output, look at the model response, and assign a score to how well my model is doing. And since this Llama model is already trained for instruction, for following instruction, it will do a great job at this new instruction, which is essentially finding an evaluation score. This is also a great time for all of you to learn about Ollama, which is a very commonly used LLM inference application. Okay. So one thing to remember is that Ollama is only a tool for generating text using LLM inference, and it does not support training or fine tuning LLM. So let me now show you the download process for Ollama so that you can follow the similar instructions on your laptop. All right. So the next step for us is to download Ollama. So I'm using a Mac here. So I'm going to show you how to install it and run it on Mac, and I'll also give you instructions if you're using Windows. So you have to go to ollama.com. So let me type ollama.com here, and you have to just click on download over here. Once you click on download, the entire, so if you're on Mac OS or Linux or Windows, you can download the appropriate version for you. So I have clicked on download for Mac OS, and you can see that the download process starts here. It's a file which is 177 177 MB. So you can download it and then you can open it, follow instructions, click on next, next, and next, and then Ollama will be installed. It's pretty simple. The installation process does not take too much time. I'm going to cancel this download over here because I've already installed it. Then what you can do is that then you have to open your terminal. So here you can see I've opened my Mac terminal over here, and then what you have to essentially type is that you have to type Ollama run llama 3. So this is the correct command, Ollama run llama 3. And let me type it over here also, uh, Ollama run llama 3. This is the command which you have to type on the terminal. And if you are using a Mac, you can directly type this command. If you are using Windows, then the command which you might need to type might be Ollama serve. So if you're using Windows, type this command first, Ollama serve, and then type Ollama run llama 3. Okay. Uh, so type these commands in the sequence. If you're using Mac, you can directly type Ollama run llama 3. Let me show you my terminal again. So here you can see I've typed Ollama run llama. Let me expand this. Let me expand my terminal so that you can see it in more detail. So here you can see that I've run Ollama run llama 3, and the when you try to run llama 3, the files which are downloaded are of size 4.7 GB. So it's an 8 billion parameter model, right? So it takes a lot of space and memory to download this. So it took around 15 to 20 minutes for me to download this on my desktop. But as the downloading is happening, you will see all of these instructions being printed out on your terminal, and at the end you will see success. When you see the success, these arrows will appear, these right hand side arrows, which means that now the Llama 3 is loaded, which means you can interact with Llama 3 large language model. You can ask any question to this. So for example, here I have asked, what do llamas eat? And now the LLM which will respond to you is not ChatGPT or any other LLM. The LLM which will respond is this Llama 3 8 billion instruct. This is that LLM which will respond to you. So that's what Ollama helps you to do. So currently I've run Llama 3 over here, right? Similarly, you can use Ollama to run any other LLM also. You can use Ollama to run Phi 3, you can use it to run Mistral, Gamma 2, etc. on your laptop. So I'm running this on my laptop, and all these results which I'm seeing are on my laptop as well. Awesome. So once you reach this stage, it will mean that Ollama is successfully running for you. So when I'm going to implement the next part of this code, please keep Ollama running. If you shut down this terminal, Ollama will not be running, and then your code won't execute. So please keep Ollama running. The simplest way to test is that just make sure to ask some question over here, and if you get a response, it means that Ollama has been running successfully. Awesome. Now I'm going to move back or switch back to code to explain the rest to you. Okay, I hope you have installed Ollama now, and you have run the Ollama run Llama 3 command on the terminal, which I have demonstrated. I have just provided a simple code block here which verifies that the Ollama session is running properly before we use Ollama to evaluate the test set responses. So our final goal is to use Ollama and Llama 3 especially to compare the output and the model response to assign a score. But before doing that, we need to check whether Ollama is running or not. So you can run this code, and here it should come Ollama running is equal to true. If this comes false, which means that Ollama is not successfully running. Now I showed you the Ollama run command on the terminal, right? There is an alternative for this command. Instead of going to the terminal each time, we can interact with the Llama model using the API through Python. So we can create a function which is called as the query model. What this function does is that you can pass in the model. So here I'm using Llama 3. So this function, when it's called, it will pass a query to Llama 3, and the query will also be provided by us. So we'll be providing the query. We'll be providing the query as the prompt. So when you call this function query model, you will have to provide a prompt and you will have to provide a model. And what this function will do is that this function will send a request. So we'll send an API request to this Llama 3 model based on the prompt, and then the response will be generated, and then the response will be returned. So instead of writing, or instead of running the uh, Ollama run Llama 3 on the terminal each time, we can simply do an API call where we can fetch the results and bring it into our Jupyter notebook interface. I am not going through this code in detail because this will distract us from the main purpose of this whole video lecture, which is to perform the model evaluation. So simply note that what this query model does is that it helps us to pass in a prompt to Llama 3 or whichever LLM which we are using through Ollama, and to give us the responses. That's it. So now what we'll do is that the prompt which we are going to give here is that this is the output, this is the model response. Compare these and assign a score. That's it. That's all we are going to do. But this function query model will be very important to us because we are going to pass in the prompt through this function. Okay, now again I want to mention that before running the subsequent code cells, ensure that Ollama is still running. The previous code which I showed you over here should print Ollama running to be equal to true, to confirm that the model is active and ready to receive requests. So now here is just a small demo of how the query model works. So in the query model here, you can prescribe the input, which is what do llamas eat, and then you can also mention the model. So here I am using Llama 3. In Ollama, you can use various models. So you can search models here and view all. So you can see the different types of models which are present um, in Ollama. So you can do Gamma 2 also here. So I can do Gamma 2 also over here. But the reason we are sticking with Llama 3 is that we are using this 8 billion instruction fine-tuned model, since it's already fine-tuned on the instruction, on a huge instruction data set. Okay, so to the query model function, you pass in any prompt and the model, and that LLM will look at the prompt and generate a response. So you can print out the response over here. Now, please note here that this process also takes a lot of compute memory. So to print out one result here, it took a long time for me because I am on a CPU. I highly encourage, if you have a GPU access, for all of you to use the GPU wherever possible. If you have a CPU, it's fine. I'm showing you only those things which can run on a CPU, but just make sure that this will take time and at least free up memory space, free up at least 15 to 20 gigabytes on your desktop for this entire code to run. So this query and printing out this result is not as straightforward as I've shown it here. It took a long time to generate this text. And to query, so let's say I've just passed in one query here, right? If I passed in three or four queries, my laptop is does not run, my laptop hangs. So that's why I can pass a maximum of two queries in one session simultaneously, otherwise my laptop just hangs because the processing speed or the processing power is not there. So now what we can do is that using the query model function, we can evaluate the responses which are generated by our fine-tuned model with a prompt. And in that prompt, we have to ask the Llama 3 model to rate our fine-tuned model's responses on a scale of 1 to 100 based on the given test response. So let me show you the prompt which we are going to give. So the prompt which now we are going to give to the query model is that given the input, and the input is going to be this. Given this input, uh, actually given the input, so it's the format input function. So the input is going to be actually the instruction along with the input. This is going to be the input over here. So given this input and the correct output, so the correct output is this output. um, so given the instruction and the correct output, score the model response. And the model response is the model response in this JSON file, which is this model response. Score the model response on a scale of 0 to 100, where 100 is the best score. So what the LLM will do now is that it will look at the output, it will look at the model response based on this instruction and the input, and then it will assign a score. So we are using the query model function which we defined earlier, and then we are passing this prompt. You see how we are using another large language model to evaluate our large language model. So we are using the Llama 3B large language model, Llama 3 8 billion large language model to evaluate our fine-tuned LLM. And here you have specified the model, so we don't need to specify it again when we call the query model, because if it's not specified by default, the query model will use Llama 3. When I share this code file with you, you can feel free to explore with other LLMs also. The sky is the limit here. It's an exploratory notebook, and I've got good decent results here, but you can of course feel free to explore with larger models, different models as well. So here you can see that I'm testing for three data points or three testing data here, and I'm printing the model. I'm printing the model response, and I'm printing the score also, which is given by the this Llama 8 billion model. Again, when I ran this code on my laptop crashed initially, and then it took around 35 minutes to print out the responses for the three instruction input output pair. So three samples in the test data. So for me, it was impossible to run this code on the entire test data set because I could only do it for two to three samples. So here is the response. So for the first query, for the first instruction, the rewrite the sentence using a simile, the our model response was the car is as fast as a bullet, and the data set, which is the actual response, is the car is as fast as lighting. So here is the qualitative evaluation which is given by the LLM. I'd rate the model response, the car is as fast as a bullet, 85 out of 100. Here's why. The response uses a simile correctly, comparing the speed of the car to something else, in this case a bullet. The comparison is relevant and makes sense as bullets are known for their high velocity. The phrase as fast as is used correctly to introduce the simile. The only reason I wouldn't give it a perfect score is that some people might find the comparison slightly less vivid or evocative. For example, comparing something to lightning as in the actual response can be more dramatic. However, as fast as a bullet is strong and effective simile that effectively conveys. So it says that although the response can be more dramatic, it still captures the essence and it still captures the grammatical meaning of a simile. So overall, the model did a great job, and the score is 85 out of 100. That's for the first. For the second, input, the actual response was the type of cloud typically associated with thunderstorms is cumulonimbus. Cumulonimbus. But the model response is a thunderstorm is a type of cloud, etc. It's pretty long. So the score for this model, as given by the Llama LLM, is 20 out of 100. And the reason is because the response doesn't directly answer the question about what type of cloud is typically associated with thunderstorms. Instead, it provides a general description of thunderstorms, which is not relevant to the original questions at all. The response also contains some inaccuracies, such as stating that thunderstorms form over high pressure regions, whereas the LLM pointed out that thunderstorms can actually occur in various weather patterns. That's why the score is 20 out of 100. In the third question, the actual response was Jane Austen, but the response of the model was the author of Pride and Prejudice is George Bernard Shaw. This is wrong. So the LLM rates is 0 out of 100. The correct answer is Jane Austen, not George Bernard Shaw. George Bernard Shaw was an Irish playwright and author, but he did not write Pride and Prejudice. The response is completely incorrect and does not provide any relevant information. This is awesome, right? It looks that the LLM which we are using is pretty smart, and it's doing an awesome job at qualitative or even quantitative evaluation. So as human, I can think of some qualitative similarities, or qualitatively I can think how to evaluate the model's response. But even the qualitative evaluation of the LLM is actually amazing. The kind of points which the LLM introduced do not come naturally to me. For example, as a human, I did not think about this dramatic effect. As a human, I did not know that thunderstorms can also occur in various weather patterns, and stating that thunderstorms form over high pressure regions might be inaccurate. So as humans, I have some limitations even in qualitative evaluation, and the LLM is filling those limitations. It's doing an awesome job at qualitative evaluation. And although the quantitative evaluation, I'm not still sure why it's 85, why it's 20. It kind of makes sense. Here it's 20 because most of the answer was wrong. Here it's 0 because it's a factual question, so the answer is factually incorrect. And here it's 85 because most of the answer seems to be generally correct. So I would trust actually the responses which have been given by this large language model. And I would say that this evaluation is being done nicely. We even have a quantitative metric now. Great. So based on the generated response, we can observe that the Llama 3 model provides reasonable evaluations and is capable of also assigning partial points or even 0 points when the answer is incorrect. The previous prompts, however, returned highly detailed evaluations. We don't want these qualitative evaluations, we just want a score. So then we can change the prompt by saying that respond with integer number only. And when you do that, the result you can see is only with integer numbers. And this is now the metric which we are evaluating. Instead of reporting the model accuracy, the classification accuracy, we are using another LLM to evaluate our LLM, and we are going to assign a quantitative score. It's still not as robust as a classification accuracy, because many people might argue that why not assign a score of 88 or 90, and this is still subjective, but it generally makes sense. And I would like to go ahead with this evaluation, although there might be other evaluations which also make sense. And that's why this field of LLM evaluation is a field of such a open research, because there is a huge scope for what are the metrics which we should use for evaluations. Does it make sense to use MMLU? Does it make sense to use another LLM to evaluate one LLM? It just leaves room open for a lot of subjectivity. When you are doing a brain tumor classification problem, the accuracy just has one value based on how many correct answers are there and based on how many wrong answers are there. But in this case, there is no one correct value, right? There can be many correct values for this. There is a lot of subjectivity in the evaluation over here, and this subjectivity itself leaves room for a lot of research and a lot of explorations. If you have compute power on your system, or if you're using GPU, here is a function which I have written, which actually goes through the entire test data set and gives and calculates this kind of a score for all of the instructions in the test data set, and then finds an average score. So I'm not actually running the above function because of hardware limitations. I'm using MacBook Air 2020. If you have a M3 MacBook Air, it takes about 1 minute on that. If you have a GPU, it might be of a similar speed. It will be very fast. So when you run the above code, you will see that our model, the fine-tuned model, achieves an average score above 50, which provides a useful benchmark for comparison against other models or experimenting with different training configurations. Well, it's worth noting that Ollama is not entirely deterministic, which means that the scores which you obtain versus the scores which I have shown over here, they might be slightly different. But in any case, we now have a framework for a quantitative evaluation. As has been mentioned over here in a lot of detail, there are a number of things which we can do to improve the fine tuning performance, right? So if you run the fine tuning on the entire test data set, you will see that the average score is just above 50, and which is not that great. So if you look at, so here is the instruction input, output, and model response, where the model has been run for all of the test data sets using M3 MacBook Air. And now if you see, some answers are correct, but some answers are wrong. So for example, let's see some sentences. Rewrite the sentence: the lecture was delivered in a clear manner. The actual output was the lecture was delivered clearly, but our model response is the lecture was delivered in a clear manner. So the model response is the same as the input. So in this case, the model is making a mistake, right? In many such cases, you will find that the model makes a mistake, but in many cases, the model is also good. So that's why the accuracy which you have obtained, the evaluation accuracy, is around 55%. So here what I have written is there can be several ways to improve the model's performance. First of all, you can adjust the hyperparameters such as learning rate, batch size, or number of epochs. Secondly, you can increase the size of the training dataset. We only used 1100 instruction input output pairs. That's why maybe, and we are using 85% as training data. So in a sense, we are only training on 800 instruction input output pairs. Those are not enough. So you can increase the size of the training data set. One thing which I can recommend you to do is this alpaca. um, so let me type this over here: Stanford alpaca. So if you go to this repository over here, they have a repository which contains data set of 52,000 instruction output pairs. So that's 50 times higher than the length of the data set which we used. If you use such a data set, you might get better responses. And I would be encouraging all of you to try the same code but on a much larger data set. And I have even showed you this data set over here, the alpaca fine tuning data set. I'll share the repository link in the video description also. Okay, then what you can do is you can experiment with different fonts, different prompts or instruction formats to guide the model responses more effectively. And then finally, you can consider the use of a larger pre-trained model, which may have greater capacity to capture complex patterns and generate more accurate responses. In our case, we used a GPT to 355 million, right? So let me show you the model which we have used in our case. Yeah, we have used a GPT to medium, which is 355 million parameters. Again, if you have the compute power or if you have access to GPU, you can use GPT to large, which has 774 million parameters, and you can use GPT to XL, which has more than a billion parameters. But again, you should do this only if you have compute power. For example, if you use GPT to XL, the number of transformers is 48 and the number of attention heads in each transformer is 25. So that's one configuration which you can definitely vary. You can vary the length or the size of the pre-trained model. A larger pre-trained model may have greater capacity to capture complex patterns and generate more accurate responses. Lastly, we can also use parameter efficient fine tuning. So the fine tuning technique which I showed you is pretty simple. It just simply uh, fine tuning or updating all of the parameters in the architecture based on the specific data set. But there are parameter efficient fine tuning techniques which have been developed, such as LoRa. And So let me just show you that LoRa parameter efficient fine tuning. And you can see that this is the kind of fine tuning where the fine tuning process is made much more efficient than normal fine tuning. I did not have time to cover this fine tuning process in this lecture or the previous lectures, but I'll share the information related to this in subsequent lectures. You can also search a bit about it, and if you have time, you can go ahead and implement parameter efficient fine tuning. It's not very difficult, but it just leads to computational speed up a lot, and sometimes it even leads to speed up in accuracy. Okay, so with that, we have come to the end of this lecture where we have successfully, in fact, uh, we have started from scratch and we have successfully fine tuned the model on the instruction data set. And now we can say that a model can answer instructions successfully, but more importantly, we have also seen the evaluation metrics. Predominantly, we saw that there are three evaluation metrics for uh, instruction fine tuned LLMs. The first is MMLU, which is measuring massive multitask language understanding. The second is human preference comparison, such as asking humans to rate LLM output. And the third one, which we have used in this lecture, is using another large language model to evaluate our LLM performance. So we have used the Meta Llama 8 billion instruct model to evaluate the performance of our model. And this was an automatic, or this was an automated way, and this proceeded in a simpler manner. That's why we use this third method. But if you have time, I would highly encourage you to use our own code, but use benchmarks such as measuring massive multitask language understanding. You will learn so much through this process. This MMLU paper is highly impactful and highly relevant. And if you want to contribute to LLM evaluation research, there is a lot of scope for this contribution, because this field is novel, it's evolving, and I think that there are still a lot of breakthroughs remaining to happen in the LLM evaluation space. So thanks a lot, everyone. We come to the end of this lecture where we covered the entire instruction fine tuning pipeline. Let me just show you that pipeline once and what all we have covered. Yeah, so we have essentially covered these 9 steps which have been showed over here. We started out with stage one, which is preparing the data set, which was very important. Then we fine tuned the large language model, and we did not stop there. We even evaluated the large language model. We extracted responses, did a qualitative evaluation, and then even did a quantitative scoring using Ollama. Through this, we also learned a new tool called Ollama. And with this, we have now come to the end of the instruction fine tuning LLM lectures. These were 5 to 6 very comprehensive and highly detailed lectures which taught you everything about the fine tuning process. Thanks a lot, everyone. I hope you have liked these lectures, which were a mix of whiteboard approach plus coding. I don't think there are any other videos out there which show about fine tuning, pre training in so much detail. The reason I'm showing you all these details is that I firmly believe that a student who knows the nuts and bolts of how models work, of how exactly things are assembled, those will be the students who will be strong ML engineers, strong LLM engineers, and those will be the students who contribute to novel research or breakthroughs. Thank you so much, everyone. I look forward to seeing you in the next lecture.